The Oval Office was unusually silent that Tuesday morning. The air felt heavy, as if the very walls were bracing for the news that had just arrived. Outside, the city was waking up. But inside, time seemed to stand still. President Trump, gripping the resolute desk with white knuckles, glared at a single sheet of paper. The headline was impossible to ignore. Canada had just signed a $214 billion trade pact with America's closest allies. The ink was barely dry, but the implications were already sending shockwaves through the West Wing. The deal rerouted global supply chains overnight, leaving the U.S. on the outside looking in. Ships that once docked at American ports were now headed elsewhere, and the world's markets were shifting in real time. His tariffs, meant to force submission, had backfired spectacularly. Instead of bringing countries to the negotiating table, they had driven them into each other's arms, forging new alliances that excluded the United States. Instead of buckling, Canada had rallied the EU, Japan, South Korea and Australia, America's traditional partners, into a new economic bloc. The world's democracies had found common cause, united by a shared frustration with Washington's unpredictability. The number on the page wasn't just dollars lost, it was a symbol of America's sudden isolation. For decades, the U.S. had been the center of gravity in global trade. Now, it was being left behind, its influence waning with every passing hour. Factories, jobs, and influence were slipping away. In towns across the Midwest and South, workers who had once believed in the promise of protectionism were watching their livelihoods evaporate. Trump slammed his hand on the desk, realizing the trade war he'd started had spun out of control. The strategy that was supposed to make America stronger had instead left it more vulnerable than ever. The quiet neighbor to the north had outmaneuvered him, and the world was watching. Cameras flashed outside the White House gates, capturing the uncertainty that now gripped the nation's capital. For American workers, the promised protection had become a devastating blow. Hopes for a manufacturing revival were replaced by pink slips and shuttered plants, as the ripple effects of the new alliance spread. The game had changed, and Trump was only beginning to grasp the scale of his miscalculation. The Oval Office, once a symbol of unchallenged power, now felt like the loneliest room in the world. The rift began in the spring of 2025, a season that should have signaled renewal, but instead marked the start of a new era of economic conflict. President Trump, having just secured a dramatic election victory, stood before the nation and the world, determined to reshape America's place in the global economy. He promised to put America first, and set out to rewrite the rules of trade that had governed North America for decades. In a move that stunned both allies and rivals, he imposed a sweeping 25% tariff on nearly all Canadian and Mexican imports. It was more than a policy shift, it was a declaration of economic war, sending shockwaves through boardrooms and border towns alike. Suddenly, goods that had flowed freely for years were caught in a web of new costs and uncertainty. The automotive industry, long a symbol of American industrial might and cross-border cooperation, was hit hardest. Canadian cars and parts, once essential to American assembly lines, were now targeted by tariffs, threatening jobs and investments on both sides of the border. By June, the situation escalated further. Tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum soared to 50%, making it nearly impossible for manufacturers to keep costs down. The price of raw materials spiked, and uncertainty rippled through the supply chain. The administration insisted these measures were about national security and reviving U.S. industry, arguing that America needed to protect its workers and regain its manufacturing edge. But the reality was far more complicated. The economies of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico were deeply intertwined. Parts and products crossed the border multiple times before reaching their final destination. Decades of integration had created a single seamless North American system. The tariffs didn't just hurt Canada and Mexico, they raised costs for American manufacturers too. Factories faced higher prices, supply chain delays, and growing uncertainty about the future. What was meant as a clean break from the past quickly became a self-inflicted wound. The disruption rippled through industries, communities, and families, upending a system that had taken generations to build. The spark was lit, and the fire of the trade war quickly spread beyond anyone's control. Tensions rose, alliances frayed, and the future of North American trade was suddenly uncertain. The consequences would be far-reaching and unpredictable, reshaping economies, industries, and lives for years to come. Canada didn't flinch. Under new Prime Minister Mark Carney, the country hit back with tariffs on $59.8 billion of U.S. goods, targeting Trump's political base. But this was just the opening move. Carney declared a national crisis and launched a bold strategy: economic diversification. Canadian diplomats quietly forged new trade deals with the EU, Japan, and Asia-Pacific nations, totaling $214 billion. These agreements created fresh markets for Canadian goods and built a coalition committed to free trade. Canada's response wasn't just retaliation, it was a strategic realignment. The message to Washington was clear: if you shut us out, we'll find new partners. The quiet neighbor had found its voice and its leverage. The pain of the trade war was both immediate and far-reaching, sending shockwaves through industries and communities across North America. What began as a dispute over tariffs quickly spiraled into a crisis that touched nearly every corner of the business world. U.S. companies like General Motors suddenly faced billions in unexpected costs, as the prices of Canadian steel and aluminum soared almost overnight. Manufacturers struggled to absorb these increases, and many were forced to pass them on to consumers or cut back on production. Retaliatory tariffs made American goods much more expensive in Canada, slashing exports and shrinking profits for countless businesses. Products that once moved freely across the border now sat unsold, caught in the crossfire of economic policy. In Canada, exports to the U.S. plunged nearly 16% within just a few months. Auto sales to the U.S. dropped a staggering 23%, leaving dealerships and suppliers scrambling to adapt to the new reality. Factories faced painful layoffs, and small businesses on both sides of the border struggled to survive. For many, the uncertainty was as damaging as the tariffs themselves, making it nearly impossible to plan for the future. Decades of seamless cross-border trade were suddenly shattered, replaced by confusion, delays, and stalled investments. Companies that once relied on predictable supply chains now faced a maze of new obstacles. Small machine shops in Ohio and food producers in Ontario, who had built their livelihoods on cross-border sales, suddenly lost access to their biggest markets. Inventory piled up and hard-earned relationships with customers were put at risk. The Ambassador Bridge, once a symbol of economic integration and cooperation, now stood as a stark reminder of a fractured economy and the fragility of international partnerships. The ripple effects reached far beyond boardrooms and factory floors, hitting ordinary families and entire communities. Jobs were lost, local businesses closed, and the sense of security that once came from stable trade began to erode. The very foundations of North American commerce were shaken to the core, leaving a legacy of uncertainty and a stark warning about the costs of economic conflict. Mark Carney's election marked a turning point for Canada. With global finance experience, he called the tariffs a betrayal, rallying Canadians to a new path. His government moved fast, launching a national effort to diversify trade and reduce U.S. dependence. "We're over the shock, but we won't forget the lesson," Carney declared. Canadian businesses were encouraged and incentivized to look beyond the U.S. toward Europe and Asia. The government provided resources to help companies adapt to new markets and regulations. Carney's approach blended firm resolve with pragmatic diplomacy, keeping talks with Washington open but negotiating from strength. Canada was no longer a dependent partner, but a sovereign nation with options. The crisis was transforming Canada's global role. A new direction was set, and the country was moving forward with confidence. The trade war reached into every Canadian home. Outraged by U.S. tariffs, Canadians launched a grassroots Buy Canadian movement. Shoppers checked labels, chose local products, and boycotted American brands. Social media campaigns and farmers' markets flourished, reinforcing national pride. Even tourism shifted. Canadians vacationed at home, avoiding U.S. destinations. The movement sent a clear message: Canadians would not fund a country hurting their economy. This unity between public sentiment and government policy strengthened Canada's negotiating hand. Ordinary people became active participants in the economic standoff. The verdict was clear: support Canada, not American goods. Nowhere was the trade war's impact felt more than in border towns. Communities like Detroit, Windsor, and Buffalo, Fort Erie, once seamlessly connected, were suddenly divided. American businesses lost Canadian customers overnight. Restaurants and hotels emptied. Workers faced layoffs as cross-border commerce dried up. The easy flow of people and goods was replaced by friction and uncertainty. Social ties frayed, and the U.S. versus them rhetoric seeped into daily life. The border became a daily reminder of the cost of turning neighbors into adversaries. The U.S.-Canada trade war was part of a global realignment. As Trump's America First agenda imposed tariffs worldwide, allies sought new partnerships. Canada's $214 billion in new trade deals was just one example. The US risked isolation. Simultaneously, the US was locked in a complex trade conflict with China, disrupting global supply chains. Tariffs on Chinese goods led to a 28% drop in imports, panicking industries like tech and autos. America's ability to forge new alliances faltered, while Canada built bridges and gained influence. The US, once the architect of global trade, now found itself sidelined. The world was moving on, creating new systems without America at the center. The chessboard had shifted, and the US was no longer in control. The consequences for American leadership were profound. As the dust settled, the future for both nations was uncertain. The old North American partnership was broken, replaced by tension and mistrust. For the US, tariffs brought higher costs, lost jobs, and global isolation, not the promised revival. Canada, though resilient, faced the daunting task of reorienting its economy away from its largest partner. The new trade deals offered hope, but the transition would be long and difficult. The relationship's future hung in the balance: cooperation or permanent division. The trade war was a stark lesson in global interdependence. No country, not even the US, could go it alone without consequences. The choices made now would shape North America's destiny for generations.